He wore a suit, carried a briefcase, and held the highest law enforcement title in the nation. But none of that mattered when two officers saw only his skin. What happened next? Cameras rolled, and justice prepared to flip the system upside down. Late afternoon at Brightport International, the busiest airport in North Carolina, was slowly fading into a soft, amber dusk as Flight 1432 from Washington, D.C. touched down on runway 17L. In the first-class cabin, Jonas Caldwell, a 56-year-old black man, exhaled quietly. His calm demeanor and contemplative gaze were framed by neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair. Tall fit, dressed in a tailored navy suit and a loosely knotted tie after nearly 4 hours in the air, he radiated the composure of a seasoned man who was always in control. Jonas didn't travel with an entourage, didn't have a motorcade or a logistics team in tow. A sudden extension of his business trip to Europe meant he carried only a black leather briefcase filled with classified documents and a small overnight bag. As the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, he was used to moving solo and discreetly. A clean record and minimal attention were non-negotiable in his line of work. But today, none of that would protect him from a fateful encounter. As he entered the transfer corridor, his eyes, trained for surveillance, immediately scanned passengers, airport staff, and abandoned objects. It was a reflex born from years in counterintelligence. But as he silently assessed the safety of the pathway, off to his right, two figures in dark blue Edison Police Department uniforms were murmuring to each other. One of them, Detective Carl Brenner, around 50, pointed to a tablet screen in his hand, then looked straight at Jonas. "Hey, Sean," Brenner said, voice firm and sure. "That's him. Black male, dark clothing. Traveling alone. Looks alert. Matches the description perfectly." Standing next to him was Officer Sean Daly. Slightly younger, his eyes still unsure, but he nodded reflexively. No one knew where that description had come from. A vague report from airport security mentioned a suspicious individual moving near Gate B4. No evidence, no unusual behavior, just someone's subjective feeling from behind a surveillance screen. But for Brenner, a man far too comfortable making snap judgments based on skin color, that was more than enough. As Jonas passed a coffee stand near the transfer corridor, the two officers moved in front of him like a human wall. "Stop right there, sir," Brenner said loudly, his voice cold as ice. Jonas halted. His eyes remained steady, but the look behind them grew sharper, watchful, skeptical. He had led major investigations, stood face to face with the most dangerous criminals. But the feeling of being stopped at an airport, for no reason other than being a black man, that was something he would never get used to. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, voice low and composed. Carl Brenner stepped forward, his eyes scanning Jonas from head to toe as if sizing up a fugitive rather than a well-dressed man just off a first-class flight. That stare held nothing back, sharp, cold, and dripping with contempt. "We received a report of a suspicious individual in this area," Brenner said, his eyes still fixed on a black leather briefcase. "And you matched the description." "Identification!" he barked before Jonas could speak. His tone sharp, clipped, as if addressing a man caught trespassing in the dead of night. "What are you doing at this airport? Why the rush? Who's waiting for you?" Jonas stayed calm, though his heart pounded. He knew these questions had nothing to do with any legitimate concern. It was just the way men like Brenner exerted control over those they deemed out of place. "I'm not in a rush," Jonas replied evenly. "I flew in from Philadelphia to make it in time for a meeting in Raleigh. Here's my ID and my digital boarding pass." He slowly pulled out his wallet with deliberate care, offering everything with both hands, just like his father had taught him as a boy. Don't give them an excuse to do worse. Brenner snatched the ID, gave it a glance, then scoffed. "Jonas Caldwell," he sneered. "Virginia." "Huh? You're dressed like you're heading to the White House." "A meeting." "Huh? What kind of meeting? Some barbershop conference." Jonas drew a breath. He'd heard remarks like this 1,000 times, sarcasm wrapped in humor. But today, the insult came with public humiliation, right there in a crowded airport, when all he had done was follow the law. "Sir," Jonas said slowly, his voice sharp as a blade, Under North Carolina law and the U.S. Constitution, I have the right not to be detained or questioned without reasonable cause. What are you basing this on? Brenner narrowed his eyes. We got a report of a suspicious man. Dark clothes, traveling alone, looked nervous. And because I'm black, wearing a dark suit, and walking alone, you assume it was me? Jonas asked, his voice low but echoing with force. Sean Daly, the younger officer, shifted awkwardly beside him. He glanced at Jonas, then back at Brenner, clearly sensing something was wrong. But he said nothing. Silence, as always. Jonas tightened his grip on the briefcase handle, his voice dropping into a resonant calm. Cooperating doesn't mean submission. I will not let myself be humiliated because you refuse to see the man and only see the color. The area around them gradually quieted. A few passengers had stopped walking. Some pulled out their phones and began recording silently. The tension hung heavy between the three men, one representing unchecked authority, one complicit in silence, and one, Jonas, refusing to bend to prejudice. And in that moment, no one realized the footage being captured on those phones would soon spark a firestorm unlike anything the city of Edison had ever seen. The moment Jonas Caldwell finished speaking, the atmosphere in Brightport Airport's terminal seemed to freeze. Though his voice was calm and his demeanor composed, Detective Carl Brenner's expression darkened. The broad-shouldered, middle-aged white man with a scowl in his eyes didn't need any more justification to escalate the situation. He sneered and suddenly snapped. I don't need a legal lesson from you. Caldwell, we have the right to detain when necessary. If you got nothing to hide, then just cooperate. Jonas stood firm, his posture upright. He could feel a surge of tension running down his spine like electricity. But resisting now would only invite greater trouble. I'm not hiding anything, officer, Jonas said slowly. I'm simply stating that my rights as a citizen should be respected. If there's no legal cause, I'd like to proceed with my journey. Officer Sean Daly, standing next to Brenner, was younger and clearly caught in his partner's emotional undertow. He glanced at Brenner, seemingly waiting for a signal. And the signal came instantly. Obstructing an officer, Brenner said, his tone sharp and loaded. That's all the reason we need. Jonas had no time to react. Two heavy hands clamped down on his arms. A sharp yank threw him off balance. His leather briefcase hit the ground with a harsh thud, causing several bystanders nearby to turn their heads in alarm. Their eyes widened at the sight. A well-dressed black man, his arms twisted behind his back in the middle of the check-in hall. Wait, I'm not resisting. I'm just asking for a clear reason. Jonas shouted in confusion and pain, his voice cracking as Officer Daly fastened the cuffs so tightly that his wrists began to go numb. He's being aggressive, Brenner yelled, clearly aiming to justify the takedown to the onlookers. This is a routine security check. People began to stop in their tracks. Some pulled out their phones and started filming. A middle-aged woman gasped, "Oh my God, he was just standing there." A young college student yelled, "This is abuse of power," but it was already too late. Jonas was forced down, his elbows striking the cold stone floor. In those few fleeting seconds, the image of him, once a keynote speaker at national security conferences, a man who had met face-to-face with heads of state, was reduced to that of a suspicious black suspect pinned to the ground in a crowd. As the two officers dragged Jonas away, he kept his spine straight, his gaze unlowered. Inside, he burned, not because of the physical pain, but because this was still happening. In 2025, to him, to millions like him. And he knew this would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something far greater. The domestic terminal of Brightport Airport seemed to hold its breath as the cold clink of handcuffs echoed through the space. Tight metal pressed against Jonas Caldwell's wrists. Nearby passengers startled. Some looked away. Others raised their phones, quietly recording an event as sudden as it was unsettling. Detective Carl Brenner, with a satisfied expression, jerked his chin at Officer Sean Daly to keep a firm grip on Jonas. "Obstruction of justice," Brenner declared loudly, as if delivering a sentence. But his tone carried triumph, not justice. Jonas was shoved toward the wall near the information desk, his arms locked behind him, his fine suit now wrinkled And yet, his eyes remained remarkably calm. Daly, though visibly hesitant, obeyed orders. The middle-aged man they were cuffing had shown no signs of aggression or threat, but to Brenner, that detail was irrelevant. Seen this type before, he muttered. Dressed sharp, talks like an academic, but always hiding something. A young woman, likely an airport employee, pushed through the crowd. Hey, what are you doing? He didn't do anything wrong. Daly raised a hand to block her, his eyes warning her back. Around them, passengers pulled out their phones, murmurs growing louder, eyes narrowing in disapproval at the officer's conduct. Then it happened. A child burst into tears upon seeing the scene, a well-dressed older black man being forced to the ground. His mother quickly pulled him away, eyes wide in alarm. That moment, more than the shouting, more than the handcuffs, was what hit Jonas hardest. The true humiliation wasn't in the force used against him. It was in the innocent, fearful gaze of a child who had just watched a symbol of dignity turn into a public suspect in broad daylight. Jonas clenched his fists. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The air thickened as he lifted his head and locked eyes with Brenner, who was still smirking. Do you have any idea what you just done? Jonas said, his voice low but heavy with authority. Brenner crossed his arms, sneering. Yeah, I just arrested someone who thinks he's above the law. Jonas didn't respond right away. He looked around, at the raised phones, at the child being carried away, then turned back, his gaze sharp as ice, his words cutting through the crowded terminal like thunder. My name is Jonas Caldwell, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The words fell like a stone in water. Every sound in the terminal seemed to vanish. Brenner froze, his mouth slightly open. His eyes flicked toward Daly, who had already turned pale. The younger officer's hands fell to his sides, as though he'd just awoken from a nightmare. Jonas continued, no need to raise his voice. My name, my position, and what you just done have been recorded by at least 6 people around us. And I guarantee every frame of it will be in the hands of the Department of Justice within 24 hours. Daly nearly collapsed, stammering. We didn't know. Sir, we didn't realize. But the drama wasn't over. A voice crackled through the radio on Brenner's shoulder. Command here. Officers at Gate B14. Cease all action immediately and await instructions. The passenger you detained is a verified high-level federal subject. Brenner went pale. His throat dried out instantly. He tried to recover. We were just following a suspicious report. Jonas slowly turned his head, not angry, but something deeper. It was a look of a man who had seen the entire system from the inside and knew exactly where its fractures lay. In that moment, the airport ceased to be just a transit hub. It became a stage where arrogance and bias were laid bare before hundreds of eyes. And history, once again, was preparing to rewrite itself. The moment Jonas Caldwell spoke those chilling words, I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The air around Gate B14 at Brightport International Airport practically froze. But before officers Carl Brenner and Sean Daly could fully react, a commanding voice thundered through the thick tension like a crack of lightning. What the hell is going on here? Every head turned toward Lieutenant Marcus Holland, the senior commander of the Brightport GPD Airport Division. He strode toward the scene flanked by 2 uniformed officers, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos. A well-dressed black man, wrists still bearing the red imprints of steel cuffs, standing tall, while 2 white officers stood drenched in sweat, visibly unraveling. Brenner. Daly. At attention, Holland barked, his voice cutting like a blade. Brenner stammered, Lieutenant, it was a misunderstanding. We. Shut your mouth, Holland snapped, his glare drilling into Brenner's face. Do you even realize who it was you just handcuffed? Brenner swallowed hard. Daly had gone ghostly pale, clutching the cuff key like a drowning man grasping a broken plank. Holland turned to Jonas, his voice steady, respectful. Director Caldwell, I'm Lieutenant Marcus Holland, head of Special Security Operations here at Brightport. I sincerely apologize for the unacceptable conduct of my officers. Jonas nodded slightly, saying nothing. His fingers still flexed around his wrist, the red mark vivid against his skin. Holland exhaled, then turned sharply. Officer Carl Brenner. Officer Sean Daly, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. He held out his hand. Surrender your weapons, badges, and radios. Now. Brenner didn't move. Lieutenant, please, don't. This was a mistake. I'm not repeating myself. Holland growled. Reluctantly, both officers removed their badges, unholstered their weapons, and handed over their radios. That act, in front of a crowd of onlookers and a forest of raised phones, was nothing short of a public verdict. A nearby passenger whispered, "Are they fired?" "No, suspended," someone replied. "But with who they just messed with, they're done." Holland ordered his accompanying officers to escort Brenner and Daly to internal security for processing. As their figures disappeared down the corridor, he finally turned back to Jonas. "Director, we will initiate an urgent internal investigation," Lieutenant Holland said. "It will be a full collaboration between the Department of Justice and the FBI. All body cam footage from both officers has already been extracted and secured." Jonas gave a slight nod. "I won't let this end with just an apology, but I do respect your professionalism, Lieutenant." Holland looked at him, sensing what was coming. Not a storm of scandal, but a storm of justice, barreling in from Washington. 48 hours after the incident at Brightport Airport, an emergency bulletin was released by the Department of Justice. The incident involving the FBI Director Jonas Caldwell will be subject to a full-scale investigation conducted jointly by the DOJ, the FBI, and the Edison Police Department. The news exploded across national media like a wildfire. At the Edison Police headquarters, a high-level emergency meeting was convened. Lieutenant Marcus Holland, the same officer who had immediately suspended Brenner and Daly, was now appointed as the official liaison for the internal inquiry. Flanking him were federal inspectors, legal experts from the DOJ, and 2 senior FBI agents flown in from Washington. All data from that day at the airport, surveillance footage, audio logs, passenger phone videos, and especially the body cam recordings, were collected and secured under tight chain of custody protocols. When Detective Carl Brenner's body cam footage was played in a closed-door session, the room grew heavy with silence. Not a word was spoken as his voice echoed. "Someone like you, dressed that sharp, what are you doing here? Smuggling? Stalking someone? Or just pretending to be important?" The words weren't just personal insults. They were irrefutable evidence of overt racial bias. Jonas Caldwell, though the man at the center of it all, remained composed, watching from his seat with the calm of someone analyzing a case detached from himself. But his eyes, sharpening with each exposed detail, cut silently into credibility of an institution already hanging by threads. Then came the first bombshell, verified by a federal investigator. Brenner had previously been named in at least 8 civilian complaints over the past 4 years, all tied to abuse of authority, baseless detainment, and racially charged remarks. In every instance, he had escaped disciplinary action under claims of insufficient evidence or lack of legal grounds. Coincidence? Or something that's been deliberately buried? One FBI agent asked. The room grew colder. The investigation didn't stop at Brenner. A review of CPD's internal reporting system revealed something far more troubling. A small network of officers, including Brenner's former supervisor, had repeatedly overridden misconduct reports, manipulated field logs, and pressured witnesses into withdrawing complaints. At a subsequent internal FBI briefing, Director Jonas Caldwell addressed his entire staff. "We cannot demand justice in the outside world if we're willing to tolerate rot within our own ranks. This case is not about punishing individuals. It's a reckoning, a chance to repair a system that's been decaying one layer at a time." And from that moment on, a quiet earthquake of reform rippled through the law enforcement system, originating from the very place where many once believed justice was nothing more than a badge on display. At the Federal District Court in North Carolina, the trial of Carl Brenner and Sean Daly drew nationwide attention. The press packed the gallery, television cameras fixed on the witness stand. This wasn't just a case of 2 officers charged with assault and civil rights violations. It was a test of the nation's trust in the very system meant to protect it. The 2 defendants sat quietly at the defense table, their faces pale and drawn. Brenner, once arrogant and openly prejudiced, now sat hunched, fists clenched, neck muscles taut with tension. Daly, younger and less seasoned, could barely hide his fear. Both wore light gray suits, stripped of badges and weapons. Before the jury and the public, they were no longer officers. They were just two men facing the weight of their actions. For the prosecution, the Department of Justice assembled a formidable team of experienced attorneys. They opened with a key piece of evidence, the body cam footage from Brenner and Daly. It was raw, unfiltered proof. Inside the courtroom, each word of insult, each abusive action replayed in high definition. The gallery sat in stunned silence. A few women dabbed their eyes with tissues. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution played the footage of Jonas Caldwell being slammed to the marble floor at Brightport Airport, handcuffed without ever posing a threat. The image of a dignified black man in a tailored suit, wrists bound, eyes blazing with cold pride, drew a collective breath from the courtroom. Then came the moment everyone had waited for. Jonas Caldwell took the stand. At 56, with steady poise and a warm, resonant voice, he didn't need to raise his volume to carry weight. He recounted the incident step by step, the insults, the suspicion, the public takedown. He never exaggerated his role, nor used his position as FBI Director to diminish anyone. Instead, he spoke with humility and justice. I'm not standing here as a high-ranking official. I'm standing here as an American citizen, a black man, a father, and a man who's grown far too used to the look of suspicion simply because of the color of his skin. His words echoed deeply in the room. Just then, in a dramatic twist, the defense introduced a previously unreleased video, recorded by a bystander at the scene, from a third-party angle. But instead of exonerating, it sealed the officer's fate. The footage clearly showed Brenner aggressively yanking Caldwell's wallet from his hand before forcefully shoving him to the ground. The sound of the wallet hitting the floor, Brenner's angry voice, and Caldwell's stifled breath rang out loud and clear. A sudden shift in the courtroom. Several people stood in shock. One prosecutor allowed a small smile to cross their face. Jonas remained still, gaze unwavering, as though he had always known the truth would rise. The courtroom held its breath until the judge's gavel finally came down to restore order. What had been a defense strategy had now become damning evidence. And from that moment forward, justice began writing a new chapter. In Courtroom 3 of the Federal District Court in North Carolina, the air felt thick with tension, compressed by weeks of testimony and national scrutiny. Every seat in the gallery was filled. The media crammed the back rows, cameras fixed close, and every breath in the room seemed to blend into one collective anticipation. Judge Wilma Green, a tough black woman in her early 60s, known for her fairness and unshakable presence, sat at the high wooden bench, eyes cold and steady as they fell on the two defendants, Carl Brenner and Sean Daly. Moments earlier, the jury had returned after hours of deliberation. The defendants sat with heads bowed, their faces drained of color. Brenner, once confident and defiant in the early days of the trial, was now just a shadow of the man he had been. Daly swallowed repeatedly, his hands trembling with nerves. Their defense attorneys, sensing the crushing weight of justice approaching, had long lost their earlier poise. Across the courtroom, Jonas Caldwell stepped to the witness stand one final time. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit and navy tie, he stood tall, calm, and commanding. At 56, this black man didn't need theatrics. He spoke only the truth, with a deep, steady voice honed over decades of leading thousands of agents across the United States. Jonas didn't dwell on his personal pain or ask for sympathy. Instead, he spoke about the system, about civil rights, and the danger of unchecked power. At one point, he looked directly at Brenner and Daly and said, in a calm, even tone, "I don't need your apology. I need your accountability." In that instant, the room shifted. Some reporters froze mid-note. A woman in the back quietly wiped away a tear. Jonas's words weren't just a statement. They were a declaration, one that echoed on behalf of millions who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Judge Green gave a subtle nod as Jonas stepped down. Then she turned to the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a Latino man, stood, holding the verdict slip with slightly trembling hands. Your Honor, on the charge of violating civil rights under Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 242, we find the defendants Carl Brenner and Sean Daly guilty. The room erupted in emotion. Daly collapsed into his seat. Brenner closed his eyes tightly, lips pressed into a hard line. But everyone understood. This was only the beginning of the price they would pay. Judge Green's voice rang out. Sentencing will proceed in the next session. The defendants are to be held in federal custody until final judgment is issued. Jonas stood, nodded respectfully to the judge, and turned to leave. He hadn't won against anyone. But justice on this day had won. Later that evening, golden sunlight poured through the windows of the top floor of FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., casting long shadows on the plush carpet of the director's office. Jonas Caldwell stood in silence at the glass, eyes fixed on the rush of cars along Pennsylvania Avenue. Below him, America went on as usual, but in his heart, one question echoed softly. If I hadn't been the FBI director that day, would it have ended the same? Jonas gently clenched his hands, where the marks on the cuffs still lingered in memory. He wasn't seeking revenge, nor was he consumed by anger, but the truth was not easily digested. He knew all too well. It was power, reputation, and that gold federal badge that had forced the system to respond seriously. But if he had been just another middle-aged black man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase through Brightport that afternoon, then what? Would those body cam videos have ever been released? Would Daly and Brenner have been suspended, tried, and convicted? Or would it have all ended with a hollow apology, an internal memo, and a man walking away with his dignity crushed? The answer, though unspoken, made Jonas sigh. It was a harsh truth, a system where justice still depended more on who you are than what is right. In the aftermath, he quietly initiated a series of internal reforms at the FBI. He increased funding for anti-bias training, expanded independent oversight to the Office of the Inspector General, and pushed for transparency tech like mandatory body cams during joint agency operations. Jonas knew he couldn't change all of America overnight, but he believed real change began from within, from those in power who dared confront truth and refused to look away. He turned back to his desk, where a new file waited. The cover read, Federal Civil Rights Protections at Public Checkpoints. Expansion Proposal. Jonas nodded. The incident at Brightport was over, but the fight for justice was not. At a closed-door FBI summit, before hundreds of agents and senior advisors, Jonas Caldwell stepped up to the podium. There were no spotlights, no thunderous applause, just him and the reverent silence of a system waiting to hear something different. Justice, Jonas began, his voice steady and deep, is not measured by skin color, rank, or title. It is measured by how we treat the most powerless when no one is watching. No one in that room would ever forget what had happened at Brightport. And yet, it was Jonas, the man once handcuffed in a crowded terminal, who had refused to let rage eclipse the mission. He didn't launch a power-fueled vendetta. He chose to build. Since that day, Jonas had championed federal anti-bias policy reform, mandated body cams at public checkpoints, and expanded human rights initiatives in local law enforcement. One of the landmark policies he helped shape was the Brightport Quality Act, passed by Congress less than 6 months later, a historic turning point. Outside, the media hailed him as the man in cuffs who changed the system. But inside, Jonas knew he was simply a man who refused to stay silent. As he left the conference hall, a young black female in turn stepped forward, eyes bright with conviction. Director Caldwell, she said, it's because of your story that I dare to dream of becoming an agent. Jonas paused and smiled. This was an ending. It was the beginning of a new generation where justice didn't require a business card and dignity no longer needed proof.